Okay, good morning now, everybody. So we're going to start where we kind of ended, which was at that descending motor track slide on 11. And what I'm doing is trying to record it through my Mac presentation, so hopefully it'll format okay for everybody. Let me know if it does not. So on slide 11 is where we're starting. Now we're going to slide 12. So slide 12 was that orientation. On figure 14.4, this is going over the lateral cortical spinal tract is what's being observed in the image. So focusing on that red pathway of what we're going to talk about. So in class last night, we discussed a little bit about the orientation. So again, we're going to go through kind of that process just real quick so we all kind of understand a little bit. So where we start off at is at the top frontal lobe, where we see on the right side is that little red circular item on the outer parts of the gyrus. That's going to have our pyramidal cells, and those are our initiation of our motor circuit planning that we discussed. And that tract then filters through what's called the internal capsule, that green label onto the left of the screen on the right side of the diagram. And our internal capsule is that white axon, white matter structure. Essentially think of it as a little filtering drain. It's taking those axons, kind of filtering them out, and then bringing them back together when they start to go pass through the midbrain at the cerebral peduncles. Now the cerebral peduncles then just help filter that axon to the pontine nuclei in the pons. Now this is significant in the purpose of this structure then communicates with the contralateral cerebellum. And what this does is, again, remember that cerebellum helps us have that blueprint, so we're able to really kind of start getting that precisional movement of that conscious, that motivational movement, such as picking up a cup and taking a drink. So at the pontine nuclei, we're going to the contralateral cerebellum. The cerebellum is then sending feedback back to that pontine nuclei, and then it continues to filter down into the upper medulla. Then we go down to the lower medulla, and that's where we get that desiccation at that pyramids. Remember, we learned about the medulla and that structure, that pyramidal desiccation. Now here, and this is when it gets a little more confusing, is where we have the division between our lateral cortical spinal tract and our anterior cortical spinal tract. And we're going to talk about those next. So that decussation is where it happens through those pyramid structures on the lower medulla. All right, now we're on slide 13. So slide 13 is just showcasing a little bit of where all of on the white matter columns, where the lateral cortical spinal tract is located and the medial cortical spinal tract. It looks like we're good. Okay, sorry, my computer was doing something funny. So the lateral group of that cortical spinal tract is going to be in the lateral white columns, or that funiculus. Okay, and that lateral posterior half of that funiculus. So, and this is again, our lateral cortical spinal tract is going to be for precisional limb movement, that voluntarily limb movement. And how that lateral cortical spinal tract, or LCT, it goes from the more lateral region is going to be our sacral, and then we're going to move in more medial towards kind of where that H structure is at, and that's going to be moving sacral, lumbar, thoracic, and cervical is what the SLTC means. So as we move more anterior, we have our medial cortical spinal tract, and this is going to be in the ventral or anterior column of the funiculus. So what's going to happen is then our axial, what this function is more of our gross motor movements, and our axial stabilization voluntary movement is going to be the medial. Okay, so now we're going to talk about how these kind of start to move from the cerebral cortex down to the spinal cord. Now that's going to be our upper motor neuron, and then we're going to go, after that, it'll become a lower motor neuron as we cross over to our skeletal muscle. Okay, we're now on slide 14. So what we're doing is going to start with the first order neuron. So the anterior and the lateral cortical spinal tract all originate the same way through that first order neuron, that upper motor neuron. As we remember, the descending tracts only have 2 motor neuron sequences. So we're going to start at that, and like we just discussed a few slides before, we're going to start at that pyramidal cell bodies and on our main motor cortices, our primary motor, premotor, and supplementary motor. Now they're going to filter through that internal capsule, which is again white matter structure. Going to go down to the midbrain, going to go into the pons, where then we're receiving information from the contralateral cerebellum to help with our blueprint or plan for our movement. And then we get to the medulla, and this is when we're going to see some changes between the anterior ventral or ventral cortical spinal tract and the lateral cortical spinal tract. So what happens here is when we get to that lower medulla is we're going to desiccate in that pyramid structure. The one that desiccates is the lateral cortical spinal tract. That's going to be to our distal limbs. That's going to help with precisional movement, so very fine controlled movements. Now it's important to note that 80 to 85% of this desiccation at that pyramids is going to be your lateral cortical spinal tract. Okay, so that's what I really want you guys to know, is when we get to that that desiccation, that's that lateral cortical spinal tract. Okay, then what happens, so there's 2 different points here. So that first bullet point is talking about that continuation of that first motor neuron of that lateral cortical spinal tract. What happens is then it goes into, it crosses over, and then it goes into our ventral gray horn. Oh, I'm sorry, let me back up. It goes into our anterior white columns. From here, then it jumps over into our anterior gray horn, synapsing. Okay, once it synapses, it then becomes a lower motor neuron. That's going to be that axon that's going to go to our skeletal muscle. Okay, so at that point of desiccation in the pyramids, our lateral cortical spinal tract then goes to our anterior white column area, and then it then jumps into our ventral or anterior gray horn of that contralateral side. So if it started on the right side as at the pyramids, it jumps then over to the left. Okay, then it synapses on the gray horn. Okay, and then it's going that ventral gray horn, and then it's going to go to our lower motor neuron. Okay, and again, if you're following that red tract on this picture, on this figure, on this slide 15 is where we're at. That desiccation in that pyramid is seeing that lateral cortical spinal tract cross over, land in the anterior white columns, then jumps to the ventral / anterior gray horn, synapsing that next cell body. It synapses to our lower motor neuron, which then will go to our skeletal muscle. Okay. Now let's go back to where we haven't had that pyramidal desiccation yet. So those uncrossed fibers are going to stay ipsilateral on that tract. Okay, that's going to be our anterior / ventral cortical spinal tract. They're actually going to keep going down on their spinal cord segment until they get to the area of where they're then going to cross. Okay, so there's not an example on this slide of this figure, but if we imagine we get to that pyramidal desiccation, it stays, okay, keeps going down through that white matter, and then say it decides on that thoracic cord segment, then it's going to jump over to the opposite or contralateral ventral gray horn and synapse with the cell body of a lower motor neuron. Okay. So if you have a pen and paper you can draw on your tablet, I want you guys to draw that same ipsilateral movement from that lower motor, from that pyramid desiccation. We're going to keep following that down, that same pathway until we get to the ventral or anterior white column of that thoracic cord segment, and then we're going to jump over to the opposite or contralateral ventral gray horn and synapse on that cell body. So as we remember, now we're on slide 16. As we remember when we were getting to our supplementary or sensory motor presentation, we talked about the gamma motor neurons and the alpha motor neurons. We're going to, because those are our lower motor neurons to our skeletal muscles, we're going to see those terms again here. So throughout our second motor neuron process, we're going to have both the lateral and the medial, once they've gotten to their ventral / anterior gray horn, there's going to be two synapses occurring there to two different cell bodies. One's going to go to our alpha motor neurons, which are extrafusal fibers that are going to aid in kind of that contractility, or that, a better word would just be that shortening and lengthening of that muscle. And that's going to be our extrafusal fibers onto our skeletal muscle. And then our gamma motor neurons, or that type is that interfusal fibers. That's where we're going to get more to our proprioception. So as we remember at that muscle spindle slide from the supplementary sensory motor PowerPoint we had in last night's class, those joint receptors as well as the proprioception within that skeletal structure, that Golgi tendon organ, those are going to, the muscle spindle, we're going to see some of that proprioception feedback, that positioning feedback, and that's going to be helping aid in that very smooth movement, being able to make sure we know where our joint is at. Okay, so this is occurring both in our lateral and our medial / anterior cortical spinal tract. Even though they both are crossing over to the contralateral sides at two different areas, they're both still working together because we need to have axial stability in order to have precisional distal movement. So they're just working together, just at different parts of when they cross over to that contralateral side. And that lower motor neuron then terminates on the skeletal muscle group it is wishing to activate for that purposeful or conscious movement. All right, now we're on slide 17. So this is just a summary of the tracts. Again, if this is a little, I know it's kind of a complicated kind of system. I do encourage you guys to go see the tutors, Lexi and Cassandra, on Mondays and Fridays over lunch, just to kind of help go over this some more and talking it out. But our cortical spinal tract summary of both the anterior and the lateral, they're both descending motor pathways. And remember, it's only a 2-motor neuron system. Okay, so 80 to 85% of the fibers that cross at that pyramidal desiccation is going to be the cortical spinal tract. Again, that's going to be our precisional movement. The lateral cortical spinal tract is our precisional limb movement, fine motor control. Now, our anterior/ventral cortical spinal tract is going to continue ipsilaterally until it gets to that spinal cord segment, either in the cervical, thoracic, lumbar areas. From that white matter, it'll continue down that white matter column, and then once it decides that I need a synapse and go to the contralateral gray horn, so say if it's descending on the right, from the right hemisphere, we get to that thoracic segment, it's going to then desiccate, jump over to that contralateral side, which then will make it on its left axial gross motor skeletal muscle it wants to go to and facilitate that movement. And once we get to those ventral horns, either from the lateral or the medial/anterior cortical spinal tract, that then becomes that synapse to that second cell body is going to be our lower motor neuron. And within those lower motor neurons, we have the extrafusal, which is our alpha motor neuron. That's going to be shortening or lengthening that muscle. And then our intrafusal, or our gamma motor neurons, which are going to be aiding in that proprioception positional movement. Okay? So now we're on slide 18. So now we're going to go over what's called the vestibulospinal tract. And the reason why we're going over this one is since we talked about that vestibular system and how it is aiding with our vision and our head positioning, our equilibrium, that system. So thought this would be one we would just go over. And so there's 2 tracts within this one, and they're both located in the medial group of the vestibulospinal tract. So they're a medial positioning in that anterior/ventral white column segment of our spinal cord. So in the diagram we have that medial and we have that lateral arrow pointing to where they are in relation to that anterior medial fissure. Okay, so the location of each of these 2 tracts, or each of these 2 tracts within the vestibulospinal system, is the upper medulla. Specifically kind of that nuclei complex for the vestibular apparatus. So that upper medulla is where they're located for the nuclei. And the function of the lateral vestibulospinal is going to be our axial and appendicular extensor muscles, so what's called anti-gravity. So essentially kind of our posture against gravity. Okay. Our medial vestibulospinal is going to be our head and neck control. So usually this medial vestibulospinal tract is going to end and terminate within our cervical spinal segments because of the head and neck control. Our lateral vestibulospinal is going to go to our thoracic, lumbar, and sacral areas. So now we're on slide 19. And where we're starting is in that first order neuron we're going to go through the medial vestibular spinal tract first. And we're starting in the medulla, okay? And then we're going to be going down our ipsilateral ipsilateral aspect to the spinal cord segment that we're going to synapse on. So the uniqueness about this tract is that it stays ipsilaterally. It does not cross. So as we can see in this diagram, it goes through that blue segment is our lateral tract and the green one's the medial. So we're going to follow that green one first. So what happens is this one axon is going to synapse bilateral nuclei, okay? Both of the nuclei, and then they're each going to stay on the same tract until it decides to synapse on both sides or bilateral sides for our head and neck control. So the first motor neuron is going to be that upper motor neuron complex where it's starting at the nuclei in the medulla. Okay, say we're on the left side in this diagram, and that green segment is our medial vestibulospinal tract. It's going to go then synapse on both of it goes from the left nuclei, then gonna synapse and head down the tracts, okay, on the same side, bilaterally at the same time, and then synapse on the head and the neck muscles we need in that cervical area. And as we remember from the cortical spinal tract, that lower motor neuron is we're going to have that gamma and that alpha motor neuron complex. Okay, so what I want you guys just to remember is throughout that medullary segment, it's just going down the same side at the same time. Okay, it never really crosses to go contralaterally. Okay, ipsilateral movement for the vestibulospinal tract. So now we're going to go to the lateral tract, which is that blue line that we're going to be following. So what happens is when we have that synapse in that lateral nuclei at the upper medulla, we're going to then project down that one side, okay, all the way down. Say it's going to stay, that first order neuron's going to stay all the way in that lateral, kind of that lateral white column area. It looks like kind of more in the anterior aspect of that lateral white column. And then it's going to synapse into that ventral gray horn on that same side, and then go to our lower motor neuron, which then the cell bodies react to our gamma and our alpha neurons, controlling whatever postural extensor we need for our anti-gravity position, okay? So So that's how kind of the first order and second order neurons are being facilitated down that descending tract. So remember, they do not originate in the cortices. Our vestibulospinal tract, if we break down vestibulo, we're going from the vestibular area in our upper medulla to our spinal tract. So vestibulo will be our first order segment, starting and originating in our medulla. And then depending on if we're going to be synapsing in the cervical, that's going to be our medial aspect to this tract. And they're going to go down bilaterally at the same time for head and neck control. And then our lateral tract is going to continue down to that segment, whether it be thoracic or lumbar or sacral, for extensor positioning, okay? And that anti-gravity extensor need for posture. Okay, so that was on slide 19. So slide 20 is just, again, kind of a summary of what this system is doing. We're receiving information from the inner ear. Our inner ear then sends and fires action potentials to our vestibular apparatus through our inner ear, our semicircular canals, our vestibule, which is our saccule and our utricle. And then it's getting to this vestibular nuclei in our medullary area, and then providing our head and neck control through our medial cortical spinal tract, and then our extensor or anti-gravity movement of our axial skeleton through the lateral vestibulospinal tract, okay? But the main purpose is for anti-gravity posture, okay? Now, if we go back to slide 19, so in the midbrain, we have this fun thing called our red nucleus, and that's in our midbrain. So what I want to get at, or want you guys to know, is that at this point in that midbrain, this red nucleus is also going to be sending information to the vestibular nuclei to have a brake system. So we're not constantly firing, because if we're constantly firing within our vestibular spinal tract, we're never going to have that sustainable midline posturing. We're going to constantly be overworking and overcorrecting. So what I want you to know with this red nucleus is it's kind of our brake system for our vestibulospinal tract. Okay, that's all I want you guys to really know. So if there's any questions about anything in regards to a red nucleus within this vestibulospinal tract, it's acting as a brake system. So we're not always firing and always having to constantly be overstimulated within our SVT tract, okay? So that's what I want you guys to know about that structure in the midbrain. All right, now we're on slide 21. So again, I just made a tone slide from last week, again, just kind of going over more tone. I know tone is kind of a varying understanding at times, but just remember that tone is overactivity communicating between the brain and the spinal cord, okay? And pathology is when we have an overactivity where we see tone, abnormal tone impacting function. And I liked this continuum aspect of what they did on page 272 in your book, where it kind of goes through this flaccid, which means no movement, no resistive, to rigidity, which is overactive movement, where we can't even get passive stretch or movement completed. Okay, so through this continuum, we'll have usually flaccidity can be initiated right off the bat. Say right after a stroke, we see this initial flaccidity, and as our brain starts to maybe try to figure out new pathways, we might see an increase in tone, and an increase in tone can be a negative or positive thing, which we'll learn more about. And we want facilitation of tone if we can get an active movement from that. But if we have too much tone, then that's when we're going to get rigidity, and that's when we're going to get maybe heterotrophic ossifications. We're going to have pain. So there's a fine line between when tone is a facilitator or useful versus when it's debilitating and painful, okay? And this is variable between each patient that has a pathological structure within our brain, okay? So have you guys read through those. And now on slide 22, I'm going to go a little bit into detail about that hypertonia and then rigidity. So hypertonia on that continuum is that velocity dependent. So this is when we're doing a quick stretch. So this is when we're going to try the modified Ashworth scale. The links I've had to the right, and the test is going to be kind of indicative of that hypertonia or that velocity dependent assessment. So this is when we're having spasticity, okay? And so velocity dependent is when the stretch, the faster the stretch, the more the resistant. So that video, the modified Ashworth test actually shows a video of somebody completing the Ashworth and how quickly they're moving these. And what you're trying to do is this clasp knife reflex. So this clasp knife reflex is when you're trying to grade how much that quick stretch is going, and then when does it break. And you grade it between a 1, 2, 3, okay, throughout that modified Ashworth scale that I'll have you guys look at on the right. And this is when that hypertonia, that spasticity, we're trying to see when it breaks and releases to grade it and assess it, so we're always knowing what's going on with the tone. Okay, this is something I use quite often with our upper motor neuron impairments, such as strokes, brain injury. We're always wanting to see where our tone is at. It's a constant assessment. Now, within that spasticity, we also can see clonus, which we talked about last week, is that constant movement, that fast twitching. Okay. And then when we get to that latter end of that continuum is when we're seeing rigidity. And rigidity is essentially an inability to passively move because of how hard the muscle tone is firing. And so usually when we see rigidity is when we have significant damage to our upper motor neuron structures. So the decebrate, so if we see that, we have lots of ease, so we're going to see more extension, okay? We're going to see extension, internal rotation of the hips and the shoulder. We're going to see flexion of the wrist and then flexion of the ankle. And we're going to see extension of the neck. Usually this damage is between the brainstem, the midbrain, the pons, okay? So between that midbrain and pons is when we're going to see image A, that decebrate, okay? Now decorticate is the defining factor of that is we're going to see more flexion in the arms, an extended neck, and our lower body still remains extension. So decorticate means more flexion within our upper body structures, okay? And this is usually damage from the superior part of the midbrain or severe bilateral lesions, of the cortex. So when we see posturing like this, it's never a positive outcome. These positions are very, very hard to stretch. It's painful to move. And a lot of the times, this is when we're seeing patients that are kind of in that vegetative or minimally conscious state where we're not able to voluntarily or volitionally help to break up that tone. Our muscles are reacting because they are unable to regulate how much that control factor of their muscles. So rigidity is not a fun thing to have to deal with as a clinician, and it's not usually a very good outcome for quality because you're constantly having to assess skin. You're getting heterotrophic ossifications. It's painful when we try to even move, roll them. Positioning them is hard. If you think about this posturing, can they sit up in a wheelchair safely? Probably not. So a lot of this positioning is typically bed bound. Okay, so slide 23, there are some this Ninja Nerd Science on YouTube to kind of go through as supplementary resources for you guys to go through for the cortical spinal and the vestibulospinal, and then just a refresher for the spinal cord. Okay, guys, we are all done. I appreciate you all for taking the time to listen to this. I'm sorry we did not get done. Again, this presentation started on slide 11, and then it goes all the way to the end of the show, end of the PowerPoint presentation. All right, I'll see you guys next week. Have a good rest of your week.